Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm your host, Matt Bennett. Each episode we talk about the research and practical aspects of the trauma informed movement. This podcast is not designed to replace mental health services. If you feel uncomfortable or triggered by our discussion, please consider seeking your own trauma treatment. In no way is seeking treatment an admission of weakness. It is a chance to build resiliency and experience post-traumatic growth. You can find show notes, resources, and more at traumainformedlens.org. Welcome, friends, to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I'm here today with a very special guest, Dr. Judith Raske Rabinor. I think I may have done the name justice. So I am so excited to have, she's allowed me to call her Judy. So I appreciate that right off the bat. But just looking at your work, really excited to talk to you, Judith, because of your expertise around several different subjects that I know trauma has impacted, and to talk a little bit about your new book, The Girl in the Red Boots. So before I dive into some of the questions that I've had looking at your expertise, just love, give our audience an introduction of yourself and your work.
Sure. Well, this is my third book, and this book really I've been working on in the background of my life for decades. I became a psychologist in my 30s, and the first patient that was ever referred to me developed anorexia right before my eyes, and this was in the 70s.
Yeah.
And it was the father who at the end of the first session came in and said to me, I think there's some new thing around. What's it called? Anorexia. Do you know about it? And I thought, oh my God, I don't know about it. I just got out of graduate school. I never even heard of it. But I started learning about it, and that became my first home. I went to study eating disorders, and eating disorders are filled with trauma.
Yeah.
I'll talk about that more after you ask me some questions. So I did that for quite a long time, and I eventually wrote a book called A Starving Madness, Tales of Hunger, Hope, and Healing in Psychotherapy. And it was about 8 people who all came to me with the same complaint: I feel fat. Some of them were fat, some of them were thin, some of them were normal weight, but they all felt fat. And my job as a therapist was to unpack those 3 little words. What does that mean, I feel fat? Because you probably know this. People can say, oh my God, I feel so fat. And you look at them and they look normal, right? Right. So anyway, I've been working with eating disorders, and I still have people in my practice who have eating disorders. And then halfway through my career, I decided I was going to write a book about divorce. And I was divorced. I wanted to write a book called 100 Things I Wish I Knew Before I Got Divorced. But that book had been written already. Every agent I went to said, no, we know about that book already. Everybody's written that book, because I got divorced in the 80s, and that was when the divorce epidemic was giant. So instead, somebody read my manuscript and they said, well, what you've done that's remarkable is you and your ex co-parented your children. So I wrote a book called Befriending Your Ex After Divorce, Making Life Better for You, Your Kids, and yes, your ex. And I said, if you can be good co-parents and not be married. It's a different skill set to be a good parent, and you don't have to stay married, but you're still parents. And my tagline was, divorce ends a marriage, not a family.
Love that.
Yeah, I love that too. And then I just had this book simmering on the back burner, and I finally got it done about a year ago, The Girl in the Red Boots, Making Peace with My Mother. And it was about my relationship with my mother, but my angle is slightly unique because I wrote about how listening to patients, I mean, what do people talk about in therapy? Come on. Mother gets a lot of hits. Mother gets a lot of hits in the therapy session. And I learned a lot from listening to my patients, and they gave me a lot of opportunities to reflect on my own relationship with my mother, and helped me put some pieces together and dig down deep and explore and heal.
Excellent.
So there you got it.
Yeah, the reason why I was interested to have you on the podcast too was it seemed like and I'd love to hear your experience having been in the field. And as you said,
Yeah,
like I even know I was got my master's in psychology in the late
mhm.
'90s, and we weren't really talking much about trauma then. And I
I
would
know.
love to see, as you've looked at these areas, obviously with eating disorders, divorce, and
Right,
family separation, and then
right.
your own honest sharing of your own experience in your
Yeah.
most recent book. I would just kind of love to get, as someone who's seen probably psychology evolve, I would imagine quite a bit in your eyes over the
Yeah.
years, just how has the thinking about trauma, how you've seen the field of psychology kind of evolve around this topic, is something that informs so much of your work and your career.
Well, it's so interesting that you asked that question because I think the field of trauma actually exploded after 9/11.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, I, my, I myself live in New York,
Mm-hmm.
and so 9/11 was really horrible. It was traumatic. No one who lives here will ever forget that day. And I joined a trauma study group after that because everybody realized, what do we know about trauma? Look, the whole city is traumatized. I was part of a team. We went down to Marsh and McLennan, which was a insurance company, and we counseled the people who had been on 55th Street, looked out the window, looked at the World Trade Center, and saw their colleagues in the
Yeah.
downtown office jump. I mean, I
Oh,
almost have the chills. It's
wow.
20 years later.
Yeah.
This is going to be the 20th anniversary of
Yeah.
9/11. Yeah. And I ran a trauma group after that. So I think trauma got a huge amount of attention then. When I learned about eating disorders, trauma was not really like the major way we thought about it, but now it is.
Yeah.
Now we see that trauma is so often what triggers an eating disorder. And you mentioned something interesting. There's a spectrum of trauma. Like,
Mm-hmm.
yes, divorce can be a trauma. It doesn't have to be a trauma. It can be a giant trauma.
Yeah.
You've met people who 20 years after the divorce, they're still talking. They're traumatized.
Yeah.
They're telling the same story over and over again.
Yeah.
He did this or she did that. They're traumatized. They have not recovered. But on the other hand, there are people who get divorced. And I certainly learned this writing my divorce book. Many people are able to be friends after divorce, quote, for the sake of the kids.
Yeah.
That's what motivates it, for the sake of the kids.
Yeah.
And then they find out, wow, this is a good way to raise your kids, to be able to get along with their mother or their father.
And I wonder, because one of the things, and I totally agree with you, as being, sort of new to the field, just a few years into my career when 9/11 happened. And I actually came out for a early trauma conference in upstate New York, but there were some folks doing studies, and you saw, this influx of funding, sort of realizing we had the adverse childhood experience study at that point, just a few years earlier, but starting to pick up traction.
Right.
When we got that, and it just seemed like this great, you got the Vanderkolts and the Blooms out there on the East Coast, really, was just a great conference. And hearing the speakers from New York City was really powerful. And one of the things I'd love to ask you, with your expertise around divorce, and this is a question that is pretty contentious and can even get touchy at times when people look at the adverse childhood experience study, is that divorce made the list. And I think it's a trigger for some folks, because I think it might be the first time to say, oh, trauma is, I divorced my partner. Is my kid going to end up dying early? Like there's like that initial trauma reaction to, oh my God, this is bigger than I thought it was. And I'd love to just, as having an expertise in this area, I would love to get your thoughts about, as a family separates for an infinite number of reasons that that happens. What do you see the impact of that, having on the children in that family system? And through your thinking about the book, how can parents help to I minimize the trauma, or maybe even not let it get to the level of being traumatic for a child in that situation?
Well, the way parents can minimize divorce, the impact of divorce on children, is by really keeping the children in the front of their mind.
Mm-hmm.
But that's very hard to do because the needs of children and the needs of parents are completely opposite.
Yeah.
The needs of parents are to go out and make a new life.
Mm-hmm.
And the needs of children are to be safe and to feel like my life is going to be fine. Whereas parents are faced with 4 or 5 worlds of exploding differences.
Yeah.
The financial world, the work world, caring for children without your spouse, even if the spouse wasn't so helpful.
Mm-hmm.
They were there. If your
Right.
kid was sick, exactly, they were there. And most people do find out when they get divorced that their spouse actually did more than they thought, even if they're happy they're divorced from them. It's hard being a solo parent. And of course, everything has to do with how many children, the ages of the children, the financial situation. I mean, for women who have to go back to work, that's a different story.
Yeah.
Those are children who they lose the nuclear family, depending on where the parent who moves out lives. So there's so many factors to take into consideration. But in writing that book, the principle I kept in mind is parents have to take the high road. They have to think continually, what is best for my child?
Yeah.
And how am I going to protect my child? And how am I going to help my child feel safe? Because I think children of every age worry, Dad, if you divorced Mom, could you divorce me? Why did you divorce Mom? You didn't like this, you didn't like that. Well, what about me? What about if I flunk geometry or have a boyfriend you don't like? I mean, it's an understandable question. And the younger the child, the more complicated it is to help them think this through.
Absolutely. Well, and
Yeah.
I think it's for folks, and that's why, when, books like yours, I think, are so important, is because, if you just break human behavior down into some of its most simplistic pieces, there's sort of fight or flight response, or even probably shut down or freeze going on with the adults of going through, at least everybody that I have met, and I haven't worked necessarily with that as a specialization professionally.
No, but you don't have to have a specialization.
Yeah.
You just have to be alive.
Yes, exactly. Well, watching my parents divorced when I was 21, and it was, I don't know if I'd call it necessarily traumatic at that point, but boy, did it turn everything upside down.
Oh, that's right.
And
That's
my
right.
role, now all of a sudden, my mom, who hadn't balanced a bank account in 30 plus years, had to figure out her finances. And
Well,
I was the one with a business degree, so all those sort of things. And I just kind of wonder, is because I think this is in many ways so generalized to even today, with what adults, what parents, what caregivers are going through with COVID, is my life is somewhat being turned around,
Right.
job fears, all this stuff. And yet I have to be that parent, that secure base in our language for the kids. I just kind of wonder if, to take this, whether it's maybe a listener who's going through relational struggles in the family context, or just a parent who's like, I just don't feel like I have anything left to give at this time due to everything we've been through. What are some of those things that you found, folks that sort of are able to go through the stress and trauma of a divorce and come out in a healthy place? Are there any characteristics that you see or help people develop?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that really makes divorce a mess is when somebody leaves their spouse for another person.
Mm-hmm.
Because then the wounded spouse feels inadequate, feels angry, feels deceived, feels betrayed. That's a completely different situation than two people who just look at each other and say, we are not meant to be together. Let's separate. So it depends the situation. I mean, that's a situation. There are two things that make a divorce really messy. One is betrayal, and the other is the money.
Yeah.
When people are reasonable and fair, but what is fair? Like somebody once said, a good divorce is when both people feel gypped. That's a horrible statement, right? It's a horrible statement.
Yeah.
But it's very difficult to divide everything up, and people wind up having fights about the picture on the wall and about the alcohol in the cabinet, who that goes to. I mean, it can be so adversarial.
Yeah.
So what makes it better for the kids is when the parents can sit down with the kids together, and not once, many, many times, and say, we decided to get divorced, but we didn't divorce you.
Yeah.
You are our children, and mommy and I are going to work things out. We're going to talk about it. And when dad and mom really can decide who's taking this child to the pediatrician, how are we going to arrange Christmas vacation? How are we arranging Thanksgiving?
Yeah.
So in good divorces, quote, good divorces, parents divide up. One gets Christmas Eve, one gets Christmas Day, and sometimes after a few years, they invite each other.
Yeah.
Do you know of any situations like that?
Occasionally, yeah. But it's the exception and not the rule.
Right. I think I know about it because I had that kind of a divorce.
Yeah.
But it didn't start out like that. Maybe after 10 years, it became that. Yeah. So very few divorces really start out, with kind of the parents having the ability to be friendly and fair and considerate and compassionate and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But I think I've named a couple of things: really keeping the best interest of the children in mind, and putting your own needs on the side. And that has to be true, even if I'll just use you for an example. If your wife left you for your best friend, I mean, imagine how hard that is to keep the best interest of the children in your mind when you feel like punching your wife and that guy every time you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Like I said, fight probably would be my, it's like all these issues, I think, and again, if two people look at each other and say, yeah, this just wasn't meant to be. Like I said, that is the exception to the rule,
Right.
to a great extent. It seems like, in my experience, a little bit professionally, but mostly personally, because it hasn't been my focus, is betrayal always seems to play some sort of role. There's one party that seems to get to maybe the point is, I don't want to be with you. They're always, in my experience, one gets there ahead, and
that's right.
In the ideal one, the other one kind of like, okay, yeah, let's work through this.
Recently I heard a story. You think that me as a therapist, I've heard every story, but I haven't. This story was the woman came home, and guess what? Her apartment was empty of almost all the furniture, including the piano, a baby grand piano that came from her family. So this husband plot and planned, and he got all these things, and it was a terrible long lawsuit. And think about how different that is than if you come home and your husband is gone, or your wife, but she put her stuff in 2 suitcases and left your house intact.
Yeah.
So at least you had your house. And then there are people who really talk about it and say, we have to try a separation, and they try to be reasonable.
Yeah.
But it's asking people to be reasonable in what is a very unreasonable situation. It's very disappointing, because divorce is really a failure to everybody. Yeah. Nobody gets married thinking that they're going to get divorced.
Right. Exactly. And that and this probably bridges us to your latest book of a very personal exploration again, the subtitle, Making Peace with My Mother. So obviously you're opening the door and going much, kind of deeper into that own experience. So this probably leads a little bit in that, but I think also probably goes back to maybe some of the trauma associated with the eating disorder as well. And
let me say something about my current book, and then we'll get back to eating disorders. So the current book, I mean, I think that I was really torn because there was one part of me that loved my mother. And my mother was very ill at the end of her life, and I was the child who was really the caregiver. But my mother is gone now 9 years. But I carried what I would call grudges.
Mm-hmm.
And I had my stories about how she did this and she did that. And
Yeah.
I was mad at her. And I felt like I could not get a really sincere apology. So, should I give you an example?
Yes, please do.
Okay. So, the book opens with me as a 49-year-old therapist giving a talk on mothers and daughters. And you see, the thing is, I think I was drawn into this field because I wanted to heal myself.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm giving a talk on mothers and daughters, and I lead the group through an imagery. And I expect that I'm going to bring up an image of my mother, who was captain of the cheerleaders, and she married captain of the football team.
Yeah.
But I don't. And instead, I remember a hot day in June when I was 8 years old. And I was all dressed up in my party dress, and my mother was taking me to my cousin's birthday. And what happened next? Well, I was a little foggy on that because where I wound up was in the hospital, and her saying to me, bye-bye, see you tomorrow. So I was having my tonsils out, and instead of my mother preparing me to have my tonsils out, she told me I was going to a birthday party. And there I am on the stretcher. I still remember this to this day, and I'm no longer 49 years old, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
I still remember when they put that mask over me, but the whole process of me realizing that I'm now in a hospital, and I woke up after a surgery and I had no idea where I was with a terrible sore throat. And the nurse telling me, don't worry, your mom will be here soon. She'll bring you some ice cream. Did you ever have your tonsils out?
No, but my sister did, so I'm familiar
You know
with
about the ice cream thing.
Yes, the ice cream is big.
But the ice cream is in no way can make up for the betrayal.
Oh no. So wow. So she told you were going to a birthday party and you
Yeah.
ended up in the hospital.
And I ended up in the hospital. And I'll tell you something really crazy that happened to me. Talk about how we can learn from and this stayed with me for my whole life. It was a theme that wove its way into my life, the fear of betrayal.
Yeah.
And often I would leave before I could get betrayed.
Yeah.
Like a friend of mine, she says something interesting about me whenever we go canoeing. She says, you're always saying, let's check the wind. We'll see which way that we want to come back with the wind. But the thing is, you can't predict the wind. You get out on a lake, and no matter what way the wind is, it could change.
Yeah.
But when you have, that is a traumatic experience when somebody thinks they're going to a birthday party and they wind up in the hospital having their tonsils out.
Wow. And I just have to, this is maybe more personal interest. And so you remember this as you were, I do a lot of training. Do you remember this as you were facilitating a training?
As I was facilitating this, and I was trying to conjure up a good thing, and instead I conjured up this bad thing. And I thought, oh my God, I haven't really resolved this yet. And that brings us to the question of how resolved you really can be with traumas.
Yeah.
And I read an article right recently by Roxane Gay. Do you know who she is? She's a really interesting woman who writes about being Black, being heavy, being abused, being sexually abused. And she had a great line in it. She said, you know, if you go to hell, do you think you don't remember it when you get out?
Wow. Right. Yeah.
I mean, a question is, how bad does it impact your life?
Yeah.
And so it's one thing to be able to remember something bad that happened to you, but it's another thing for it to topple you over.
Right.
Right. So I mean,
yeah.
Go ahead.
You know, and that even set up the question I wanted to ask, even much better than if I would ask it before you sharing that powerful example is, And I think this is, maybe it was growing up Midwest religious. I'd love to get your opinion on this, but
Okay.
for me, I always, forgiveness was always such a big part. And it was almost like this ingrained thing. It wasn't like, even through 3 years of psychology, I just thought forgiveness was a part of the process. I had a guest on years ago now, Robert Mahler, who, let me look at his book real quick, Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up, just said, you don't always have to forgive. And I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. Because it was, I think then it integrated into my therapy is, oh, you've got to forgive to move on. So, while we look, I know, at least from my limited experience with eating disorders, it's usually something rooted in childhood trauma for most of the situations that I have seen, somewhat related to that. Obviously, we already talked about betrayal with divorce, and now, what a betrayal that you experienced. How would you ever trust your mother again, would be my obvious question. And I wonder, as your idea of working with trauma all your career, what is your idea of forgiveness, and the role that plays?
Yeah. So you notice I don't have the word forgiveness in my title, do
Right.
I? I'd say making peace with, and I feel the word that makes more sense to me is the word acceptance.
Yeah.
The word acceptance. So my mother told me that the pediatrician was the one who gave her that advice. And I actually do believe that, because I've heard this from other people of my generation, that sometimes the pediatricians would tell people that. But what disturbed me was that I felt like my mother couldn't really hear how traumatizing that was for me. And that she just was like a little too quick to tell me, just forget it. You're fine. You're fine. So what do we have to talk about this anymore for?
Right.
And so I think that, if there are any parents out there listening, because, all parents make mistakes. They might not make that mistake, but they make other mistakes.
Right.
Parents make mistakes, and everybody may. And so the question is to be able to really listen to what someone tells you, your child or your partner, and really take it in and really think about the impact and listen and say, I'm really sorry.
Yeah.
Let me think about that with you. Let me think about that.
Mm-hmm.
That's even true for divorce, since probably there are people out there listening right now. They might not have had my tonsils experience, but I bet there's a big bunch of people who have or have had the divorce experience, to really to be able to say to a child, I know this is going to be hard for you, so I'm available to talk to you.
Yeah.
Like, can we talk about it? Like, what's hard? It's hard for kids who have half their stuff at mom's and half their stuff at dad's, or go back and forth on weekends. And it might be okay when they're 8, but it's not okay when they're 14.
Yeah.
And they want to have their own teenage lives. And for the parent to be able to be available, I'm available. That's a big bonus. Not have to just sweep it under the rug and say, everything's fine, you're lucky. Because in fact, divorce isn't always the worst thing. It could be worse to stay married.
Right. Absolutely.
It's not that divorce is in itself, it's how these things are handled.
Yeah.
Just like, believe it or not, I was at a lawyer's office, and I was trying to make an appointment with her for the following week. And I said to her, she said, I won't be in next Friday because my daughter's having her tonsils out. So my ears perked up. I was writing this book. I had the manuscript in my briefcase. And I said, oh, really? And she said, yeah, we're not sure of the date, so we haven't told her yet. So I said, really? I said, when do you plan on telling her? She said, oh, maybe the day before. I said, well, hello. She knew I was writing a book. I said, let me tell you something. Can I give you my personal opinion? I said, just not even as a psychologist, but as a psychologist and as a person.
Yeah.
Don't tell her the day before. Tell her many days before and help her, prepare her. Let her get a little suitcase. Let her get a little stuffed animal to bring with her. Tell her throat's going to hurt. Tell her, prepare her is the point.
That she'll get ice cream.
And the ice cream then might be a reward, but if as long as you're prepared. You might feel a little scared. You might feel a little uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know about forgiveness. I think acceptance is
Yeah.
more a viable thing to strive for. Just
Yeah.
accepting that people are imperfect. And
Yeah.
one thing, can I tell you one thing that helped
Yeah.
me
Please do.
uh, forgive my own mother? And I'd say I did forgive it, but it took me a lot of years. So I don't know. It occurred to me that when I was older, when I was 30, my father was diagnosed with cancer, and the doctor told us, don't tell him he's dying.
Mm. Wow.
And tell
That.
him he's getting better. Tell him he's getting better. And I wrote this in the book about how there was an incident that occurred, and my father was like in a rage. He was being told by everybody, his children, his adult children, me and my brother, his wife, he's getting better. And he knew he wasn't getting better. He's sitting in the house having trouble breathing, losing weight, and he's being told he's getting better. And I went along with this, and I had to ask myself, I really did have to do some soul searching. Why did I go along with something that is ridiculous?
Yeah.
And it made me think, okay, my mother was 28 years old or however old she was, and she went along with something that was not good. And people do things that wind up hurting other people. That's right.
Yeah, well, and the medical professionals that were giving this, and
Yeah.
I just, and it doesn't when you say that the pediatrician told your mother to do it
Mhm.
that way. I guess
Mhm.
at first it's shocking, but it's not surprising for what we know. I mean, this is a little bit of a sidetrack. I'll just throw it out there and we can drop
That's
it. It's
okay.
like,
I like your sidetracks.
yeah, it's just like you look back historically as somebody who's now, pushing 50, about like the history of parenting advice
Mhm.
throughout last century. And, it's just horrific to think about it. I know my mom, when she was raised, you weren't supposed to breastfeed your children. Like it was
Right.
these
Exactly.
like, yeah, so it's like I don't necessarily, the pediatrician probably got that advice from somebody else as well, but just these like things that are now like obvious to us with these mistakes. It's just like, yeah, it's so horrific that your mom may have been told that, but at the same
Right.
time you step back and it's like, okay, like, yeah, it probably is true. And the same thing with your father. I mean, it, lying to people, we know, as working with families, lies are pretty much the most
Right.
dysfunctional
Secrets
thing.
are often the source of all kinds of trauma. All
Yes,
kinds of
yes.
trauma. Exactly. I mean, you were
Oh,
asking me
go
about
ahead.
eating disorders, and I would just like to, anybody out there listening. So there are eating disorders that, like, I mean, over the years, I've seen hundreds of people, mainly girls and
Mm,
women, but men also now have eating disorders,
yeah.
where sometimes an eating disorder, it's just like a temporary phase
Mhm.
that one girl sees her friend dieting, goes on a diet, goes off the deep end. I do want to say this, an eating disorder is always masking something.
Yeah.
And if it's addressed early enough, it could be masking that she lost her best friend, that her boyfriend dropped her, that she was jealous of her sister. Anything can get buried under the symptoms of an eating disorder, any emotional problem. But if it's nipped in the bud and the person is able to be helped to think, what are you doing? Like, how is eating 800 calories a day helping you? And what else could be going on? What else could really be bothering you? Let's take a look at your whole life. And if then it can be something that they can recover from very rapidly.
Yeah.
And so that's very different than somebody who's sweats it out in the throes of an eating disorder for 4 or 5 years, gets hospitalized, kind of like misses life for
Yeah.
4 years.
Yeah.
So just like with divorce, there's a continuum. There are
Yeah.
divorces that are not so traumatic. I guess I think divorce is always extremely stressful.
Yeah.
It's extremely stressful. It doesn't have to be traumatic, but it's always stressful. Well, an eating disorder is always very stressful, but somebody can be a parent who sees their kid is starving herself.
Yeah.
And we're going to a therapist, and within a month they're seeing a therapist, and then the problem gets resolved. Well, that's very different than somebody with a 5-year history and who gets hospitalized 3 times, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that the idea of masking it plays powerful, because a lot of my work, especially early on in my career, was like in the child welfare
Hmm.
arena with children. I all had complex, just devastating traumatic histories. And, I wish somewhere along the line, again, somebody would have informed me about even what to look out for, because I think, I can look back and say, yeah, the eating disorder that one way or the other was manifesting was definitely a masking or coming from the traumatic experience. And I think it's just an area that I think we need so much more education in, because I even think about like the wrestlers, and I think it's a different scenario, but I always remember like in high school, those
Right.
wrestlers who were running around the gym in like trash bags and not eating for days at a time to make weight. And they weren't always, I mean, they were destroying themselves in some ways. And I know a few of them at least had a lot of trouble kind of getting out of that mentality, but boy, did we not talk about that
Well,
at
what's
all.
really interesting is the reason people have trouble getting out of that mentality, because we live in such a screwed up culture
Absolutely.
where being thin or being buff or being
Yeah.
fit is rewarded.
Yes.
And it doesn't matter what the cost is.
Yes. Yeah.
So if you really think about it, to somebody who feels confused, let's say you were talking about high school, they don't know
Yeah.
what they really want to their life,
Right.
but they know that they're going to get a lot of pats on the back
Yeah.
for being a top wrestler
Yeah.
or being the skinniest girl in the class.
Yeah. Yeah.
And therefore, and they know there's so much information out about how you lose weight, how you
Right.
stay fit, what kind of exercises you do.
Yeah.
So it's like a formula for thinking you're going to be fine, whereas in fact, you're not fine and you're making yourself completely unfine.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
In the wrestling thing, and I think it'd be a pretty easy jump in some ways to think about negative reinforcement from being the most popular, person in the class, finding that weird thing of beauty that we've adapted as a culture. But it's like, boy, if the friends of mine who were wrestlers didn't make weight, they let down their whole team. So and this is still going on in
I
these like
know it's
combat
still going
sports. So
on.
it's like, can somebody step back and can we think about this in a healthier way? But I think whether it's the cultural perceptions of beauty or some of these sports that are designed to just put you in this unhealthy physical state, it's like,
Right.
yeah, some of this is like, can we just call timeout and rethink a little bit of this?
Exactly.
So the other question that I had, that I really wanted to ask, and I ask these of all the authors that come on, is, and feel free to throw a few out here, is
Sure.
one of the reasons I love writing books, even though there's things about writing books that I don't love. The one thing I do is like, you have to think about things differently. Like, I saw you had a blog, I read, podcasts. Like those are one ways of thinking. Even training, there's a way of thinking about content and providing expertise. But then putting pen to paper, there's always surprises that come out. And I wonder if you had any sort of things that maybe came out, especially in an incredibly personal, writing project. I wonder, as you've got the book, you can hold it in your hands. You can say you can get this on Amazon or wherever books are sold. And those sort of fun things. I wonder, as you look back at the process, are there some things that sort of pop up to say that even surprised you throughout this process, or became more important as part of your own journey and your own personal narrative around your relationship with your mother and family?
Yeah, well, that one of the things I want to say two things. One is that what I like a lot about writing, because I'm a very energetic person like you are,
Yeah.
and writing is very calming. You have to like slow down.
Yeah.
You have to slow down to write, even if you write with a computer. You have to slow down and think. And so one of the things that I really did think about was the things that I did that might have hurt my own children.
Yeah.
And that gave me a lot of pause and compassion for my mother. And the one thing that motivated me to write this book is that in working with so many mothers and daughters, and a lot of them were daughters who had eating disorders, and the mothers would come in with them. Now, why did the mothers come in? Because that's how the society still works. It's mainly mothers who bring daughters to therapy. I'm not saying 100% of the time, sometimes not, but it still seems like this is primarily the mother's job. But I was always interested in how much compassion I had for the mothers when the daughter would be yelling at the mother, why did you do this? Why did you do that? Why did you do this? Why did you do that? And I would want the mother to get her story out. And that helped me think about my mother. And I'll tell you, there's a line I wrote, and it was, my mother was born in 1918, which was 1 year before women got the right to vote.
Wow. Yeah.
And I wrote, and I never understood how much that fact shaped her life until right now. And that's really the truth. Like, I grew up in a different era from my mother, and my mother grew up in an era where women listened to their husbands and they listened to the doctor. Now you go to a doctor, what do you do when you come home? You immediately Google whatever the doctor told you. Right? You're fact checking everything.
If you didn't diagnose before you went in.
But my mother grew up in a different era where women had different ideas, and just what you said about child rearing. So that helped me realize that she honestly did do the best she could do, and that she had done a lot of amazing things in her life. And I started just reevaluating. It's like, we've all seen this. You can look at a meal and you can seize upon the thing you like most or the thing you hated most.
Yeah.
And so I would say that I changed in writing this book, that in writing about my mother and writing about her life, I came to understand and appreciate and accept her. I don't like the word forgive. I don't know why. I just don't like it, but I like the word accept.
Yeah.
You don't have to forget and you don't have to forgive, but you do have to accept that this is just what happened.
Yeah. And I wonder, what for that, because being therapists, we can often get in our head pretty big with this stuff. So I wonder what, with this experience, I'd love to just hear, were you able to really have these conversations about this with your mother while she was still alive?
Well, I did. And that again brings me to the acceptance thing. First of all, my mother, for much of her life, I criticized her because she was Miss Pollyanna. Everything was great, marvelous, fine, and whatever went wrong, it'll be fine.
Yeah.
And that irked me. Well, one of the things I understood was that that's how I became a therapist.
Yeah.
I became a therapist so I could spend my days telling people, well, if you're sad, let's take a look at it.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at it. Let's try to understand what happened that has made you so unhappy. Or if you're spending all these hours a day lifting weights, let's try to understand what this is really like for you, what's driving you. It wasn't just, that's great, let's move on, right? But it really gave me an appreciation for how I became a therapist. I don't know if I would have become a therapist if I didn't come from the family I did. Yeah. I don't know if you ever think about how your family impacted you being a therapist.
Yeah. It's interesting because, I'm a survivor of childhood trauma myself. And it's I was fortunate enough, and looking back, is that the trauma happened outside the home. And I had that secure, safe attachment and base, throughout that process. Doesn't mean that the struggles weren't just all encompassing at times. But yeah, it was this really interesting thing. And my parents were both educators. So while education and psychology are not the same thing by any stretch, there's a lot of, I think we're called to these professions. So I think that was always a part of it. And then, as I was going through trauma treatment myself, I was like, oh, I could be this for other people. And I think, luckily enough, I didn't have to worry about, experiencing homelessness or food insecurity, so in some ways it was like, I love Dr. Bloom's sort of thing is like your attachment is Windows on your computer. It operates for better or worse in the background. And so, my way of looking at, even though my parents' marriage didn't last, it was intact until I was in grad school, which, then you're self-analyzing yourself all the time, which, not the best time either to have that happen, but, better than if I was like 4 or 5, because they did provide a great home. But yeah, it's an interesting thing that I look at that as being so fortunate of having that base in the background. And, I know my parents wouldn't, say that they were perfect either, but it was like, boy, lucky enough. And I think I was drawn into child welfare, juvenile justice, because, whether it was unconscious at first, but very quickly conscious is, I could use my expertise that I was building to help kids that never had this experience of security and safety, and, try to help them have a little bit of what I have. So yeah, definitely can connect with that a little bit in the background, I think, but came to the surface once I got in the field and started, really doing the work too.
So if you think about it, I mean, I feel being a therapist is one of the best decisions I ever made in my life.
Yeah.
And I might not have made it if a bunch of things, that tonsil story is just the first story in the book. I can't tell everybody all the stories, or otherwise why would they read the book? And of course, that's right. But I think that it is interesting how we can come to revisit our own stories and understand that the glass was half full rather than half empty. I hate to sound like my mother, because that was actually
a little Pollyannish.
but the thing is, we do get our strengths and our resources from our families. You know what Bessel van der Kolk says? He says, ask every trauma survivor 2 questions. Who's your support system, and what are your resources?
Yeah.
And I love those 2 questions because, we're born to need people.
Yeah.
And having a support system is crucial to having a rich life. And the resources that we get, sometimes we get them because we live through what we do live through. Like there's, I don't know if anybody ever talks about post-traumatic growth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My favorite words to come out of my mouth, for sure. Yeah.
It's a great topic, right? That, what did Hemingway say? What doesn't kill us makes us stronger.
Yeah.
But the key word in that is what doesn't kill some of us makes us stronger, but some people don't get stronger. They just fall apart.
Yeah.
They have too much.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and it's that mentality that I find interesting, because I was a big existential Nietzsche fan until my first day of work, when I realized these youth weren't in existential crisis because they all came from the same zip code. They were all even though, my minority population way overrepresented in the systems. So, it quickly became, my life philosophy kind of left with about the 5th file that I read of my caseload. But it's like that interesting thing of, but, at the same time, it's like almost what doesn't kill you if you get help makes you stronger. Like it's like,
exactly.
Nietzsche was just missing just a little bit to add on to that. Because I think, in some ways, I think that's like people feel like, well, what's wrong with me? Because I just couldn't pull myself up by the figurative bootstraps and walk this off. And, where I really think this message and messages like yours that, hey, this, I may look good now, but look what I have been through and look what I've done to get through that. A lot of times we'll see, Oprah went through all this trauma. Now Oprah is Oprah. Well, you take the time to listen to Oprah or or your story, and you see what happened in between those two things, which is really key. Yeah, it does make me stronger, but I may not have gone here if it wasn't for my protective factors of family and the professional help I got as well.
I mean, that's an interesting thing, that other people's stories really are resources.
Yes, yes.
And I guess that's why we like to read and we like to write and we like to listen to other people, because hearing how people have coped with life offers us tools. Every story has a tool buried
Yeah.
in it, right?
Absolutely. Well, I think that is a great introduction to tell people a little bit about the book, how to learn about you, and as always, we'll put information in the show notes. But yeah, just give a plug for your book. Where do people get it?
All right. So you can go to my website, which is Judith Ruskay Rabinor. You're going to put it up later?
Yeah, we'll definitely put that in the show notes.
Judith Ruskay Rabinor, PhD.com. And you'll see links to a bunch of independent bookstores. Shakespeare and Company is one of the ones in New York. I don't know if you know that bookstore, but it's very charming.
We went to the one in Paris.
I know, I've been to the one in Paris too. But anyway, it's of course nothing. Now we're having a book launch on Zoom because there is no. Yeah, but that's just how life is right this minute. And you can hear about all the other things I'm doing, because I do workshops and I'm running something on Mother's Day. I'm giving people a little writing exercise, because that's something I love to do. I'm a writing teacher now. I think writing is very healing, and that's a conversation for another day. Correct?
Yes. Well, I would love to have that conversation. This has been fabulous.
I think so too.
Yes, thank you for your work, getting it out there in the way your decades of helping folks.
And thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, the invitation's always open. And again, you can find all the information about the book and all the other work at traumainformedlens.org. We'll put all the links in there. Thank you, my friend, for joining us. Good luck with the book. And
great.
Yeah, it's an open invitation if you ever want to come back. This was a great
conversation. I'll want to come back. We'll see when we're going to do that. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.